The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet Sandra had once feared. This silence carried warmth, the kind that settled gently after a long day filled with laughter, voices, and small moments that stitched a family together. Ava and Arya were asleep in their room, their soft breathing drifting through the hallway like a steady rhythm of peace. The lights in the penthouse were dim, and the city outside shimmered under the night sky, just as it had on so many nights before. But tonight felt different. Sandra stood by the large window, her fingers lightly resting against the cool glass. The reflection staring back at her was no longer the same woman who had once collapsed onto the kitchen floor, broken and alone. She saw strength now. She saw someone who had survived loss, rebuilt her life, and somehow found love again in a way she never thought possible. Behind her, Peter stepped quietly into the room. He had removed his jacket, his sleeves rolled slightly, his presence relaxed but thoughtful. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply watched her, as if memorizing the way she stood there, the calmness in her posture, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her long before either of them realized it. "You're thinking again," he said softly. Sandra smiled faintly without turning. "I do that sometimes." Peter walked closer, stopping just behind her. "About what?" She took a slow breath. "About how everything changed so quickly, and yet it didn't feel rushed." Peter nodded. "The best things usually don't." Sandra turned then, leaning lightly against the window. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had found out sooner?" The question lingered between them. Peter's expression shifted slightly, not with discomfort, but with honesty. "Every day," he admitted, "I think about how different their first years could have been, how different Natalie's life might have been." Sandra studied his face carefully. "Do you regret it?" He shook his head slowly. "I regret not knowing, but I don't regret where we are now." There was something steady in his voice, something that didn't try to rewrite the past but accepted it. Sandra nodded gently. "Neither do I." For a moment they stood there in quiet understanding. Then from the hallway a soft voice broke the silence. "Mommy." Sandra turned instantly. Arya stood at the edge of the hallway, rubbing her eyes, her hair slightly messy from sleep. Ava appeared behind her a second later, holding Daisy the stuffed rabbit tightly. "What's wrong?" Sandra asked, kneeling down as they walked closer. "I had a bad dream," Ava whispered. Peter crouched beside them. "Want to tell us about it?" Ava shook her head and buried her face into Sandra's shoulder. Arya climbed onto Peter's lap without hesitation, curling up comfortably. Sandra exchanged a glance with Peter. It was one of those moments that required no discussion. They simply knew what to do. "All right," Sandra said softly. "Tonight is a family sleepover." Ava lifted her head slightly. "In your room?" Peter smiled. "Best spot in the house." Within minutes, blankets were gathered, pillows arranged, and the large bed transformed into a cozy space filled with soft laughter and quiet comfort. Ava lay between Sandra and Peter, while Arya curled up beside Peter, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "Tell us a story," Arya murmured sleepily. Peter looked at Sandra. "You want to start?" She smiled. "No, this one's yours," he thought for a moment, then began. "Once upon a time there were two very brave girls, who lived in a tall building in a big city." Ava smiled softly. Arya's eyes fluttered as she listened. "And they had a mom who was the strongest person anyone had ever met." Sandra glanced at him, her eyes warm, and one day a very nervous man knocked on their door, not knowing his entire life was about to change. Ava whispered, half asleep. "That's you." Peter chuckled quietly. "Yes, that was me. And he thought he came there to find something he had lost," he continued, his voice softer now. "But instead he found something even more important. A family." By the time he finished, both girls were asleep again. The room fell into a gentle silence. Sandra looked at Peter, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was a good story," he shrugged lightly. "It's still being written." She reached for his hand under the blanket, intertwining her fingers with his. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." The days that followed carried a new sense of stability. Not the fragile kind that Sandra had once feared would break at the slightest change, but something deeper. Something grounded. Peter moved into the penthouse gradually, not in a way that disrupted the rhythm of their home, but in a way that blended seamlessly into it. A few of his things appeared in the closet. His coffee mug found a permanent place beside Sandra's in the kitchen. His presence became constant, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. The twins adjusted naturally. To them, nothing felt strange, nothing felt forced. Peter had already been part of their lives long before the wedding. Now things simply felt complete. One afternoon, as Sandra worked on a design project at the dining table, Ava ran up to her holding a drawing. "Mommy, look!" Sandra turned her laptop slightly and smiled. "What did you make?" Ava held up the paper proudly. It was another family drawing, but this one was different. There were 4 figures again, but this time, above them, Ava had written in big, uneven letters, "The Cole family." Sandra's breath caught for a moment. Arya appeared beside her. "We practiced spelling it." Sandra looked at Peter, who was standing nearby, watching quietly. "Do you like it?" Ava asked. Sandra smiled, her eyes soft. "I love it." Peter stepped closer. "Can we put it on the fridge?" Ava nodded excitedly. "Yes." As he placed the drawing carefully among the others, Sandra realized something important. This wasn't just her home anymore. It was theirs. That evening, as they sat together for dinner, laughing over something Arya had said, Sandra felt a quiet sense of peace settle inside her. For years, she had believed that happiness came once in a lifetime. That love, real love, was something fragile and rare. But life had proven her wrong. It hadn't just given her a second chance. It had given her something stronger. Something built not on perfection, but on resilience. Something that had grown through loss, through uncertainty, through patience. And now, as she looked around the table at the people who had become her world, she understood something she hadn't before. The story hadn't ended when everything fell apart. That was just where a new one began. Morning arrived gently, with sunlight stretching across the wide windows and slipping into every corner of the penthouse. The kind of light that didn't just wake you up, but reminded you that life was still moving forward, steady and patient. Sandra was already awake. She stood in the kitchen, quietly stirring coffee, the soft clink of the spoon echoing in the calm space. For a moment, she simply watched the steam rise from the cup, letting her thoughts settle. It had been weeks since the wedding, weeks since Peter officially became not just part of their lives but part of everything. And yet every now and then a strange thought still crossed her mind. This is real, not fragile, not temporary. Real. Behind her she heard soft footsteps. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Peter walked in, still half asleep, his hair slightly messy, his expression relaxed in a way that only came when someone truly felt at home. "Coffee?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "You read my mind." She handed him the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. It was a small moment. But small moments were everything now. Peter leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip. "You've been up long?" "Not really," she replied. "Couldn't sleep much." He studied her for a second. "Something on your mind?" Sandra hesitated. Then she nodded slightly. "Everything just feels calm," she said. Peter raised an eyebrow. "That's a problem?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. "No, it's just I'm not used to it." Peter understood. Not because she explained it perfectly, but because he had lived his own version of that feeling. When life had been chaos for so long, peace almost felt unfamiliar. "Give it time," he said gently. "You'll get used to it." Sandra looked at him, her expression soft. "I think I already am." Before he could respond, a loud thud came from the hallway, followed by giggles. Both of them turned instantly. "Uh-oh," Peter said. Sandra sighed, already smiling. "That's never a good sign." Ava and Arya burst into the kitchen seconds later, both talking at once. "Mommy, Arya pushed me." "I didn't push you, you tripped." "I did not." "You did." Peter crouched down, raising a hand slightly. Okay, one at a time." Ava crossed her arms dramatically. "She knocked over my tower." Arya rolled her eyes. "It was already falling." Sandra leaned against the counter, watching them with quiet amusement. This chaos, this noise, this life. It was everything she once thought she had lost forever. "All right," Peter said calmly. "Let's investigate." He walked toward the living room with both girls following closely, still arguing under their breath. Sandra stayed back for a moment, listening to their voices fade slightly as they moved away. Then she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, taking it all in. When she stepped into the living room, she found Peter sitting on the floor, examining what used to be a carefully built tower of blocks. "It's a tragic situation," he said seriously. Ava nodded. "Very tragic." Arya tried not to laugh. Sandra folded her arms. "And what's the verdict?" Peter looked up. "We may need to rebuild." Ava gasped. "Together?" Peter nodded. Team effort. Within seconds, both girls dropped to the floor, already gathering pieces. Sandra watched as Peter joined them, helping rebuild the tower from scratch. No frustration, no impatience, just calm, steady presence. It was something she noticed often now. Peter didn't just show up, he stayed, fully, completely. Later that afternoon, the house was filled with the quiet hum of routine. Sandra worked on her laptop, The twins were busy with coloring books. Peter was on a call in the other room, his voice calm but focused. For a moment, everything felt perfectly balanced, until Sandra's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello. There was a brief pause, then a voice, professional, measured. Is this Sandra Davis? Her grip tightened slightly. Yes, this is attorney Michael Reeves. I'd like to discuss something regarding Natalie Hart. Sandra's entire body stilled. Natalie. The name alone was enough to shift something deep inside her. I'm listening, she said carefully. There are some legal matters that have recently come to light, the man continued, and they may directly affect you and the children. Sandra felt her heart rate pick up. What kind of matters? Another pause. Then a financial trust. Sandra frowned. I don't understand. It would be best if we discuss this in person, he replied. It's quite substantial. Her mind raced. Natalie had never mentioned anything like that. Never hinted at it. Where are you located? Sandra asked. Downtown. I can schedule a meeting as soon as possible. Sandra glanced toward the living room, at Ava and Aria, at the life they had built. Tomorrow, she said quietly. That works, the man replied. I'll send you the details. The call ended. Sandra stood there for a moment, her phone still in her hand, her thoughts moving faster now. A trust? From Natalie? It didn't make sense. Peter stepped into the room a few minutes later, noticing her expression immediately. Hey, what happened? Sandra looked up at him. There's a lawyer, she said slowly. He says there's something about Natalie, something that affects the girls. Peter's expression shifted. What kind of something? A financial trust. Peter frowned slightly. Natalie never mentioned anything like that. Sandra shook her head. No, he stepped closer. When's the meeting? Tomorrow. Peter nodded once. I'll come with you. Sandra hesitated. You don't have to. I know, he said gently. But I want to. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. That night, after the girls were asleep, Sandra sat alone on the balcony again. The city lights stretched endlessly before her. But her mind wasn't calm this time. It was filled with questions. Why would Natalie leave something behind without telling her? Why now? And what did it mean for the girls? Behind her, the door opened quietly. Peter stepped out, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed her one without a word. She took it, wrapping her hands around the warmth. You're thinking too much, he said softly. Sandra exhaled. I don't like surprises like this. Peter leaned against the railing. We'll figure it out. She nodded slightly. I thought I understood everything about what happened, she admitted. And now it feels like there's something I missed. Peter looked at her. Whatever it is, we handle it together. Sandra met his gaze. There it was again, that steadiness, that quiet promise, together. She took a slow breath. Together, she repeated softly. Inside, everything was still peaceful. The girls were sleeping, the house was quiet, but something had shifted. Not in a way that broke anything, but in a way that hinted at something new, something unresolved. Because sometimes the past didn't stay buried. Sometimes it found its way back. The next morning arrived with a quiet tension that settled into the air before anyone even spoke about it. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, lingering beneath the normal rhythm of breakfast, school bags, and small conversations. Sandra tried to keep everything as routine as possible. She packed lunches, tied Ava's shoelaces, reminded Aria to take her reading book, and smiled when they laughed about something small and unimportant. But inside, her mind kept returning to the same thought. The lawyer, Natalie, the trust. Peter noticed it too. He didn't say much, but he stayed close. When Sandra handed him a coffee, his fingers lingered just a second longer than usual, a quiet reassurance. Everything's going to be fine, he said softly. Sandra nodded. I know, but she didn't know. Not really. After dropping the girls off at school, they drove downtown together. The city felt different today. The buildings seemed taller, the streets busier, the noise sharper. Maybe it was just her state of mind, but everything felt slightly off balance. Peter parked the car outside a tall glass building. This is it, he said. Sandra looked up at the structure, then took a slow breath. Okay. Inside, the lobby was quiet and polished, filled with the kind of silence that came from expensive design and controlled movement. They checked in at the front desk and were directed upstairs. The elevator ride was short, too short. Sandra barely had time to steady herself before the doors opened. A receptionist greeted them and led them into a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A man stood as they entered, mid-50s, sharp suit, calm expression. Mrs. Davis, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Sandra shook it. You're Mr. Reeves? Yes, he glanced at Peter. And you must be Mr. Cole. Peter nodded. I am. They all sat. Sandra didn't waste time. You said this was about Natalie. The lawyer folded his hands neatly on the desk. Yes, he said. And about something she left behind. Sandra felt her chest tighten slightly. What exactly did she leave? The man opened a folder and slid a document across the table. A trust fund. Sandra looked down at it, her eyes scanning the numbers. Then she froze. The amount was enormous. Her breath caught. This can't be right. It is, the lawyer replied calmly. Peter leaned forward slightly, his expression focused. Where did it come from? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Natalie Hart came from a very wealthy family. Sandra blinked. No, that's not possible. Peter glanced at her. You didn't know. Sandra shook her head slowly. She never told me anything like that. The lawyer nodded. She wouldn't have. According to the records, she was estranged from her family for several years before her death. Sandra tried to process that, all those years, all those conversations. And Natalie had never said a word. Why? Sandra asked quietly. Why would she hide something like that? The lawyer hesitated slightly. There was a disagreement, a serious one. She chose to walk away from the family entirely. Sandra looked down again at the document. And this trust? It was established shortly before her death, he explained. In the event that anything happened to her, it was meant for her children. Sandra's throat tightened. She planned this? Yes. The weight of that realization settled heavily. Natalie knew. Somewhere deep down, she must have known something could go wrong, and she had prepared for it. For her daughters. Sandra swallowed hard. And why am I only hearing about this now? The lawyer took a slow breath. Because the trust was contested. Peter's expression sharpened. By who? Natalie's family. Sandra's eyes lifted instantly. They wanted the money. They claimed the trust was invalid, the lawyer said, that Natalie was not in the proper state of mind when she created it. Sandra felt a flicker of anger rise. That's ridiculous, Peter nodded slightly. Sounds like a legal strategy. It was, the lawyer confirmed, but the case has recently been resolved. Sandra leaned forward slightly. And? The court ruled in favor of the trust. A small wave of relief passed through her. So, it belongs to the girls? Yes. Silence filled the room for a moment. Sandra sat back slowly, trying to absorb everything. Natalie, her best friend, had been carrying a secret life, a wealthy family, a broken relationship, and a plan to protect her children no matter what. Why didn't she tell me? Sandra whispered. Peter looked at her gently. Maybe she didn't want that life anymore. Sandra nodded slowly. That sounded like Natalie. Strong, stubborn, determined to choose her own path, even if it meant walking away from everything. What happens now? Sandra asked. The lawyer closed the folder. The funds will be transferred into accounts under the children's names. You, as their legal guardian, will oversee everything until they come of age. Sandra glanced at Peter. He gave a small nod. All right, she said quietly. The meeting ended shortly after, but as they stepped back into the elevator, Sandra felt like the ground had shifted slightly beneath her, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that changed things. Are you okay? Peter asked softly. She exhaled slowly. I don't know. They walked out into the city, the noise of traffic and people rushing past them. She never told me, Sandra said again. Not once. Peter placed a hand gently on her back. Some people carry things they don't know how to share. Sandra nodded. I just wish I had known. Peter looked at her. You know what matters most? She glanced at him. She trusted you, he said. With everything. Sandra felt her eyes sting slightly. She did. They stood there for a moment. Then Peter added quietly, This doesn't change who you are to those girls. Sandra looked at him. And what is that? He smiled softly. Their mother. Something in her chest settled, because deep down, that was the only thing that truly mattered. That evening, after they picked up the twins, life returned to its usual rhythm. Homework, dinner, laughter. But something new had been added beneath it all. A layer of truth, of understanding, of a past that was no longer completely hidden. As Sandra tucked the girls into bed that night, Ava looked up at her sleepily. Mommy? Yes? Will you always be here? Sandra smiled gently, brushing her hair back. Always. Arya reached for her hand. Even when we grow up? Sandra's heart softened. Even then. The girls seemed satisfied. Within minutes, they were asleep. Sandra stood there for a while, watching them, thinking about everything she had learned that day, about Natalie, about the choices she had made, about the life she had left behind, and the life she had created instead. When Sandra stepped out of the room, Peter was waiting in the hallway. She's still taking care of them, Sandra said quietly. Peter nodded. In her own way, Sandra leaned against the wall, her voice soft. I think I understand her better now. Peter stepped closer. And? She wasn't running away, Sandra said. She was choosing. Peter watched her carefully. And she chose you, he said. Sandra closed her eyes for a second, then nodded. Yes, that night, as she lay in bed beside Peter, the city lights glowing softly through the window, she realized something important. The past hadn't come back to break them. It had come back to remind them of love, of trust, of promises that never fade, and of a friendship that still lived on. In the two little girls sleeping down the hall, the days after the meeting did not explode into chaos the way Sandra had quietly feared. There were no dramatic interruptions, no sudden changes in routine, no visible cracks in the life they had built. Instead, everything continued almost exactly the same on the surface. But underneath, something had shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift that broke things. It was the kind that made you look at everything a little differently. Sandra noticed it in small moments. When Ava laughed, she found herself wondering about the life Natalie had walked away from. When Arya asked questions about the past, Sandra paused just a little longer before answering, and when she looked at the girls now, she didn't just see the children she had raised. She saw a story that had been bigger than she ever knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, Sandra sat at the dining table reviewing some paperwork the lawyer had sent over. The documents were detailed, filled with numbers and legal language, but one thing was clear: the trust was real. And it was significant. Peter walked in, loosening his tie slightly, his expression calm but thoughtful. Still going through that, he asked. Sandra nodded. It's a lot to take in. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her. Anything concerning? She hesitated. Not concerning, she said slowly. Just unexpected. Peter glanced at the papers. Money changes things, Sandra looked at him. Do you think it will? Peter didn't answer immediately. Then he said, It can, if you let it. Sandra leaned back slightly. I don't want anything to change, she admitted. Peter nodded. Then it won't. She gave a faint smile. You make it sound simple. He shrugged lightly. Sometimes it is. Sandra studied him for a moment. You've lived with money your whole life, she said. Does it ever feel heavy? Peter thought about that. Not the money itself, he said. But what comes with it? Like what? Expectations, he replied. Control. People trying to decide what your life should look like. Sandra's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. That's what Natalie walked away from. Peter nodded. Probably. Sandra looked down again at the documents. I don't want that for them. Peter's voice softened. Then they won't have it. She looked up. How can you be so sure? Because they have you, he said simply. The answer settled into her chest in a way she didn't expect. Because it wasn't about control, or money, or circumstances. It was about the kind of home they had built. And that wasn't something money could change. Later that night, as they sat together in the living room while the twins played nearby, Sandra found herself watching them more closely than usual. Ava was drawing again, completely focused, her tongue slightly sticking out in concentration. Arya sat beside her, flipping through a book, occasionally glancing over to comment on Ava's work. Peter was on the floor with them, helping tape a piece of paper to the wall. It was a simple scene, ordinary, but Sandra felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not exactly. Just awareness. Because now she knew something she hadn't before. Their lives were connected to something bigger, something that could, one day, come knocking. And this time, it might not be as simple as a man at the door. The thought lingered longer than she liked. The next few weeks passed without incident. The legal paperwork moved forward smoothly. The trust accounts were finalized. Everything was placed securely under Sandra's supervision, just as the lawyer had explained. And for a while, it felt like that was the end of it. Until one afternoon, Sandra was in the kitchen when the intercom buzzed. She wiped her hands and walked over, pressing the button. Yes? Ma'am. The doorman's voice came through. There's a visitor asking for you. Sandra frowned slightly. Who is it? There was a brief pause. Then they say their name is Victoria Hart. The world seemed to still for a second. Hart. Sandra's grip tightened on the intercom. Did you say? Hart? Yes. Ma'am. Her heart began to beat faster. Natalie's last name. This wasn't a coincidence. Send her up, Sandra said quietly. She released the button slowly. Behind her, Peter stepped into the room, his expression already alert. Who is it? Sandra turned toward him. I think it's Natalie's family. Peter's jaw tightened slightly. That was fast, Sandra nodded. Too fast. She didn't like it. Not at all. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the apartment in a way that felt heavier than usual. Sandra walked toward the door slowly. Peter stayed just behind her, not stepping in front, not taking over, just there, ready. She opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman standing in the hallway was elegant, perfectly composed, dressed in a way that made it clear she was used to a certain kind of life. Her posture was straight, her expression controlled, but her eyes carried something deeper, something harder to read. "Mrs. Davis," she said calmly. Sandra nodded slightly. "And you are?" "Victoria Hart." There it was. Confirmed. Sandra stepped slightly into the doorway, not fully inviting her in yet. "What can I do for you?" Victoria's gaze shifted briefly past Sandra, taking in the apartment behind her. Then she looked back. "I believe you're raising my niece's children." The words were polite, but the meaning underneath them wasn't. Sandra's voice remained steady. "I am." Victoria nodded slowly. "I'd like to speak with you." Sandra didn't move. "About what?" Victoria held her gaze. "About my granddaughters." The air between them grew tense. Sandra felt it instantly. This wasn't like Peter. This wasn't someone unsure or searching. This was someone who had come with purpose, and possibly with expectations. Peter stepped slightly closer behind Sandra, not interrupting, but making his presence known. Victoria's eyes flickered toward him for a brief second. Then back to Sandra. "May I come in?" she asked. Sandra hesitated. Every instinct in her body told her to be careful, but another part of her knew something else. This moment was inevitable. She stepped aside. "Come in." Victoria entered the apartment slowly, her gaze moving across the space, the drawings on the fridge, the toys in the corner, the signs of a real home, not a perfect one, but a lived-in one. She took it all in quietly. Then she turned back. "They've grown," she said softly. Sandra's chest tightened. "You've seen them before?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. Then, from a distance, Sandra didn't like the sound of that. Not at all. Peter's voice came, calm but firm. "Why are you here?" Victoria met his gaze. "I think that's obvious." Peter didn't respond. But the tension in the room shifted again. Sandra stepped forward slightly. "You said you wanted to talk," she said. "So talk." Victoria took a slow breath, then said, "I want to be part of their lives." The words landed heavily, direct, clear, no hesitation. Sandra felt her heart rate rise. And just like that, everything changed again. Because this wasn't about the past anymore. This wasn't about something hidden or forgotten. This was about the future. And who had a place in it? Sandra didn't respond immediately. For a moment, she simply stood there, studying the woman in front of her. Victoria Hart looked calm, composed, and completely certain of why she was here. There was no hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in her voice, and that alone made Sandra cautious. Because people who arrived without doubt usually expected things to go their way. "I see," Sandra said finally, her tone neutral. Victoria nodded slightly, as if that answer had been expected. "I understand this may feel sudden," she said, "but they are my granddaughters." Sandra's eyes didn't leave her face. "They are my daughters," she replied calmly. The correction was gentle, but firm. Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she gave a small, controlled nod. "Yes," she said. "I'm aware of the legal situation." There was something about the way she said it that made Sandra's guard rise even higher. Aware, not accepting, not respecting. Aware. Peter stepped forward slightly now, his presence more defined. "And yet you're here," he said. Victoria looked at him again, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she replied, "because legal situations don't erase blood." The room fell quiet. Sandra felt the weight of that sentence settle heavily in the air. Blood. It was always the word people used when they wanted to claim something. Or someone. Sandra crossed her arms slightly. "And what exactly do you expect?" she asked. Victoria didn't hesitate. "Access," she said simply. "Time with them. The opportunity to know them, and for them to know where they come from." Sandra's jaw tightened just a fraction. "They know where they come from," she said. Victoria's gaze softened slightly. "They know part of it," she corrected gently, "but not all." Sandra felt something stir in her chest, a mix of frustration and protectiveness. "They're 5 years old," she said. "They don't need complicated truths right now." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Children are more capable of understanding than we give them credit for." Peter spoke before Sandra could respond. "This isn't about what they can understand," he said calmly. "It's about what's best for them." Victoria looked at him carefully. "And you've decided that already?" Peter met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes." There was a brief silence. Then Victoria's attention returned to Sandra. "I'm not here to fight you," she said. "If that's what you're thinking?" Sandra held her gaze. "Then why does it feel like you are?" Victoria exhaled slowly. Because I've already lost one daughter, she said quietly. I'm not willing to lose my granddaughters too. The words landed differently, not sharp, not demanding, but heavy and real. For a moment, Sandra saw something in her that hadn't been visible before. Not control, not entitlement, grief. But grief didn't erase caution. Sandra took a slow breath. They're not something you can just step into, she said. They have a life, a routine, a sense of stability that took years to build. Victoria nodded. I can see that. Sandra gestured slightly around the apartment. Then you understand why I won't let anything disrupt that. Victoria's expression remained steady. I'm not here to disrupt, she said. I'm here to join. Sandra almost let out a dry laugh. Join? She repeated. Yes. Sandra shook her head slightly. It's not that simple. Victoria didn't argue. I know, she said, but I'm willing to take it one step at a time. Peter studied her closely. And if we say no? Victoria's eyes met his. For a moment something flickered there, something sharper, but it disappeared just as quickly. I would prefer we don't reach that point, she said calmly. Sandra caught that, not a threat, but not a surrender either. The room grew quiet again. Then, small footsteps. Ava's voice echoed from the hallway. Mommy? Sandra's entire posture shifted instantly. She turned toward the sound. Ava and Arya stood at the edge of the living room, looking curious. Who's here? Arya asked softly. Sandra walked toward them, kneeling slightly. Just a visitor, she said gently. Ava peeked past her. Victoria stood still, watching them, and for the first time, her composed expression cracked. Just slightly. Her eyes softened. Her breath seemed to catch. Sandra noticed it. Of course she did, because that look, she had seen it before. The first time she held them, that instant connection, that overwhelming feeling. But Sandra's protective instinct didn't fade. It strengthened. She stood again, placing herself subtly between the girls and Victoria. Victoria took a small step forward, then stopped, as if unsure how close she was allowed to come. Hello, she said softly. The girls looked at her curiously. Hi, Ava replied. Arya tilted her head. Do we know you? The question hung in the air. Sandra's heart tightened. This was the moment, the line, the truth waiting just beneath the surface. Victoria looked at Sandra briefly, then back at the girls. I knew your mother, she said gently. Ava's eyes lit up slightly. Mommy Natalie? Victoria nodded. Yes, Arya stepped a little closer. Did she tell you stories too? Victoria's lips trembled just slightly. Yes, she whispered. She did. Sandra watched carefully, every word, every reaction, every shift, because this wasn't just a conversation. This was the beginning of something. Something that could either blend into their lives or tear at the edges of it. Peter stepped beside Sandra now, not blocking, but present, grounded, a quiet reminder. This was their family, built with time, with love, with effort. Victoria looked at all of them, the girls, Sandra, Peter, and for a moment, she seemed to understand this wasn't a space she could take. It was one she would have to earn. Slowly, carefully, Sandra finally spoke, her voice calm, but clear. We're not making any decisions today. Victoria nodded. I didn't expect you to. Sandra held her gaze. But if you're going to be part of their lives, it will be on our terms, Peter added quietly. And at their pace, Victoria looked at them both, then gave a small, respectful nod. That's fair, Sandra exhaled slowly, because nothing about this felt easy. Nothing about this felt simple. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of the story. It was another beginning, another layer, another test. And as she looked at Ava and Arya standing there, unaware of how much their world had just expanded again, Sandra knew one thing for certain. She would protect this family, no matter what it took. Victoria didn't stay long that first day. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with something quieter, an understanding that nothing would be decided quickly and nothing would be taken lightly. Before leaving, she looked at the twins one more time, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt careful, measured, like someone standing at the edge of something they didn't want to lose again. I'll wait to hear from you, she said to Sandra. Sandra gave a small nod. We'll think about it. Victoria didn't argue, didn't push, and that alone made the situation more complicated, because resistance would have been easier, clearer, but patience. Patience meant she wasn't going anywhere. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And just like that, the apartment felt different again. Not broken, not shaken, but aware. Sandra stood still for a moment, her hand still resting on the door handle. Behind her, the girls' voices filled the space again. Mommy, who was that? Sandra turned slowly. A friend of Natalie, she said gently. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either, not yet. Arya frowned slightly. Another one? Sandra smiled faintly. Something like that. Peter watched her carefully. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, but he understood. This wasn't a conversation for now. That night, after the twins were asleep, the tension finally surfaced. Sandra stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, her thoughts moving faster than she could organize them. Peter leaned against the counter across from her. "She's not going to walk away," he said quietly. Sandra shook her head. "No, she's not." There was a pause. Then, "I don't trust it," Sandra admitted. Peter didn't react immediately. "Because she's their grandmother?" he asked. Sandra looked at him. "Because she showed up now," she said. "After 5 years." Peter nodded slowly. "That's fair," Sandra exhaled sharply. "Where was she before?" she continued. "Why didn't she fight for them back then?" Peter crossed his arms thoughtfully. "Maybe she did." Sandra frowned. "What do you mean?" "The trust was contested," he reminded her. "Her family was involved. Maybe that was their way of trying to regain control." Sandra's chest tightened slightly. "That's worse." Peter didn't disagree. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Silence filled the space again. Then Sandra spoke softer this time. "I don't want them caught in something like that." Peter stepped closer. "They won't be." She looked at him. "You can't promise that." He met her gaze. "I can promise we won't let them face it alone." Sandra's shoulders eased slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The next few days passed carefully, deliberately. Sandra didn't rush into a decision. She watched, observed, thought, and more than anything she paid attention to the girls, because at the center of all of this was them. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Ava looked up suddenly. "Mommy? Yes? Are we going to see that lady again?" Sandra's heart skipped. Children noticed more than adults realized. She kept her voice calm. "Maybe," she said. "Why?" Ava shrugged. She looked like she wanted to say something. Sandra glanced at Peter, then back at Ava. "Sometimes people do," she said gently. Aria tilted her head. "Is she nice?" Sandra hesitated, then, "I think she's trying to be." It was the most honest answer she could give. That night, after the girls were asleep, Sandra made a decision. Not a final one, but a step. "She can visit," Sandra said quietly. Peter looked at her. "Supervised?" Sandra nodded. "Controlled, limited, slow." Peter considered it, then nodded. "That's reasonable," Sandra exhaled. "It's not about giving her what she wants," she said. "It's about doing what's right for them." Peter stepped closer. "And you think this is?" Sandra looked at him. "I think they deserve to know where they come from." The words weren't easy to say, but they felt right, even if they were complicated. A few days later, Victoria returned. This time, the atmosphere was different, still cautious, still careful, but more defined. Sandra opened the door with a steady expression. "You can come in," she said. Victoria nodded slightly. "Thank you." The twins were already waiting in the living room, curious, excited in a quiet, uncertain way. "Hi again," Ava said. Victoria smiled gently. "Hello?" She didn't move too quickly, didn't try to close the distance all at once. Instead, she sat where Sandra indicated, and waited. Aria walked a little closer. "Do you know more stories about Mommy Natalie?" Victoria's expression softened. "Yes," she said. "Many." Ava's eyes lit up. "Tell us one." Victoria glanced at Sandra, asking permission without words. Sandra gave a small nod. Victoria turned back to the girls. "When your mommy was little," she began softly, "she once tried to climb a tree in a dress." The girls giggled instantly. And just like that, the tension eased. Not completely, but enough. Sandra watched carefully, every word, every reaction, because this was how it would start. Not with big moments, but small ones, stories, conversations, pieces of the past, slowly being introduced into the present. Peter stood beside her, his voice low. "She's being careful," Sandra nodded. "I noticed." He glanced at her. "Still unsure?" Sandra didn't answer right away. Then, "Yes, because trust didn't come easily. Not anymore. Not after everything." But as she watched Ava and Aria laugh at something Victoria said, she also saw something else. Not control, not entitlement, but connection. And that made things harder. Because the truth was, Victoria wasn't a stranger. She was part of their story, whether Sandra liked it or not. And now, she was part of their future too. The days that followed felt like walking a careful line between two worlds. On one side was the life Sandra had built over the past 5 years. Stable, warm, predictable. A home filled with laughter, routines, and the quiet comfort of knowing exactly where everything belonged. On the other side was something new, something uncertain. A connection to a past that had once been completely out of reach, now slowly unfolding in front of them. Victoria's visits remained limited, once a week, never too long. Always with Sandra present, and always careful, very careful. She never overstepped, never tried to claim space that wasn't offered. Instead, she listened more than she spoke, watched more than she acted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the girls began to respond. Ava started greeting her at the door with a small wave. Arya began saving questions for her, especially about Natalie. What was Mommy's favorite color? Did she like dragons too? Was she funny? Victoria answered each question with patience and honesty. She loved green, she said once, because it reminded her of fresh starts. Sandra noticed that. Fresh starts. It sounded like something Natalie would say. And for the first time, she didn't feel resistance when Victoria spoke, just curiosity. One evening, after another visit, Sandra stood by the window again, her arms folded loosely, her thoughts quieter than they had been days ago. Peter joined her, holding 2 cups of tea like he always did. Progress? He asked gently. Sandra took the cup. Maybe. Peter smiled faintly. That's better than nothing. Sandra nodded. She's not what I expected. Peter raised an eyebrow. In a good way? Sandra hesitated. Then in a complicated way, Peter chuckled softly. That sounds about right. They stood there for a moment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She loved them, Sandra said quietly. Peter glanced at her. Victoria. Sandra nodded. I can see it now. Peter didn't seem surprised. Does that change things? Sandra thought about that. Then it makes it harder, she admitted. Peter leaned against the railing. Harder? How? Sandra sighed. Because if she didn't care, this would be easy, she said. I could just shut the door and not think twice. Peter nodded slowly. But she does care. Sandra looked down at her tea. Yes. Silence settled between them. Then Peter spoke again. Caring doesn't mean she gets to decide anything, he said. It just means she's human. Sandra looked at him. And what does that make me? Peter smiled softly. It makes you the one who chooses what happens next. The answer stayed with her, because that was the truth. This wasn't about control or ownership. It was about choice, and she had one. A few weeks later, something small happened. But it changed everything. Victoria was visiting again, sitting in the living room with the twins as they showed her their drawings. Sandra was in the kitchen, pretending to organize something while quietly listening. Look, Ava said proudly, holding up a new drawing. Victoria smiled. It's beautiful. Arya pointed at one of the figures. That's Mommy. Then she pointed at another. That's Papa. Victoria nodded gently. And who's this? She asked, pointing at the third figure. Arya hesitated, then said, That's you. Sandra froze. Just for a second. In the living room, Victoria didn't speak. Her expression softened in a way that was impossible to hide. Me? She asked quietly. Ava nodded. You're the lady who tells stories about Mommy. Victoria's eyes glistened slightly. That's very kind of you, she said softly. Sandra stepped into the doorway then, watching, listening, feeling something shift. Because that moment, it wasn't forced, it wasn't guided, it wasn't planned, it was natural, and that mattered. Later that night, after Victoria left, Sandra sat beside the twins as they got ready for bed. Do you like her? She asked gently. Ava shrugged. She's nice, Arya nodded. She knows a lot about Mommy. Sandra smiled faintly. Yes, she does. Ava looked at her. Can she come again? Sandra hesitated. Then yes, she said softly. The girls smiled, satisfied. As Sandra took them in, she felt something settle in her chest. Not uncertainty, not fear, but acceptance, not of everything, not completely, but enough. When she stepped out into the hallway, Peter was waiting. He studied her face for a moment. You've decided something, Sandra nodded. She stays. Peter didn't ask what that meant, he understood. She stays, she repeated. But on our terms. Peter smiled slightly. That's how it should be. Sandra leaned lightly against the wall. You know, I used to think family was something you either had or lost. Peter stepped closer. And now, she looked at him. Now I think, it's something you build. Peter reached for her hand. And sometimes rebuild. Sandra smiled softly. Yes, inside the apartment, everything felt warm again. Complete, not perfect, but real. The girls were asleep. The city lights glowed outside. And for the first time since Victoria had appeared at their door, Sandra felt calm. Because nothing had been taken from her. Nothing had been broken. Instead, something had been added. Carefully, slowly. In a way that didn't replace what they had, but expanded it. And as she stood there with Peter, her hand in his, her heart steady, she realized something important. Their story had never been about avoiding change. It had been about growing through it. And now, their family was bigger, stronger, and more complete than ever before.